All right. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Working People, a podcast about the lives, jobs, dreams, and struggles of the working class today. Brought to you in partnership with In These Times magazine and the Real News Network, produced by Jules Taylor, and made possible by listeners and supporters like you. Working People is a proud member of the Labor Radio podcast network. If you're hungry for more worker and labor-focused shows like ours, follow the link in the show notes and go check out the other great shows in our network. And please support the work that we're doing here at Working People so that we can keep growing and keep bringing y'all more important conversations. You can do that by leaving us a positive review on Apple Podcasts and, of course, sharing these episodes on your social media and with your coworkers, friends, and family members. And, the single best thing that you can do to support our work is become a paid monthly subscriber on Patreon for just $5 a month. And if you subscribe for $10 a month, then you will also get a print subscription to the amazing In These Times magazine delivered right to your door every month. All you got to do is go to patreon.com/workingpeople. That's patreon.com/workingpeople. Hit the subscribe button and you'll immediately get access to all of the awesome bonus episodes that we've recorded and published for our amazing subscribers over the years. My name is Maximilian Alvarez, and I got to tell you guys, I'm feeling a little naked and afraid over here. So, if you guys follow our producer Jules on social media, or if you listen to his great podcast, No Easy Answers, then you know that Jules is currently blazing down the open road, driving his way back home to Texas. So first and foremost, let's all send our boy lots of love and a big bon voyage on his trip. And let's all pray for me while we're at it, because I won't have Jules to edit episodes for the next 2 weeks. Now, you might be saying, but Max, didn't you record and edit and promote the show all by yourself for the first 3 seasons? Yes, and I don't miss it. So the reason I brought Jules on to produce the podcast is because he's way better at producing it than I am. And now I've just gotten too cozy with that arrangement. I've gone soft, and I feel like I've just totally forgotten all my old basic editing tricks. So I'm going to, keep things real simple here. We're going to keep this intro nice and tight, stitch it onto today's episode, and call it a day. But, if you notice a change in the quality of the production, then you can blame me for that. Don't blame Jules. And obviously, this also means that we're going to be waiting until Jules is back home and ready to hop back in the saddle. Then he's going to, help us bash through the regular and bonus episodes that I'm recording while he's gone. But rest assured, we've got some really killer content for you guys coming in the second half of the month. Before we get there, though, we've got a special episode for y'all today. Now, if you can believe it, this is the final installment in our special series of conversations with teachers, organizers, scholars, and activists in Wisconsin that I got to record this past summer as part of a special collaboration between the Real News Network and In These Times magazine for the Wisconsin Idea, which is a limited reporting project created by People's Action Institute, Citizen Action of Wisconsin, and In These Times. And that also means that this is the final episode to come out of that big reporting trip last summer that I, Cameron Granadino, and Hannah Faris from In These Times got to do together. As you guys know, we started with a critical series of video and podcast interviews and panels, and a video documentary that we published over at The Real News on farming communities in western Wisconsin and their fight against big agriculture and the factory farming industry. Then, we kicked off season 5 of Working People with the current series of video and podcast interviews and panels from our second shoot in Wisconsin, which focuses on the fight of educators and other public sector workers to rebuild worker power and the labor movement a decade after the devastating passage of Act 10 under Republican Governor Scott Walker, which, as you guys surely know by now, essentially stripped collective bargaining rights from public sector workers in the state. And it made it much more difficult for workers to organize, and it forced unions to take massive concessions on health care, retirement benefits, and much, much more. So I guess, I should say that this is the last installment of our Wisconsin series that we're going to be running on the podcast. But the final culmination of the whole series will be a second video documentary that we're going to be publishing really soon over at The Real News. So you guys should keep an eye out for that. And if you want to see us do more work like that, then you should support us and spread the word about all the cool shit that we're doing. But, I'll be honest. I knew that I wanted today's interview to be the last one in the series because, I knew that it focused directly on Act 10, the massive statewide protests against it, and the devastation that it has left in the state for the past 11 years. But I had actually forgotten how incredible this conversation was and how fitting it is to have it round out the whole series. Especially when I think about all the excitement around the labor movement right now, which is great. I think that it's really, really important to listen to the folks that we talk to in Wisconsin and to listen to the stories that they tell, because these are the stories about how and why the labor movement has declined over the last half century. These are the stories about mistakes that we need to learn from and that we cannot afford to make again. These are the stories about how the union-busting, ruling class-serving right wing achieved victory. And, these are also stories of hope and heart and of working people rebuilding from the rubble. And, I just hope that people listen. And, we credit them on all of the Wisconsin Idea pieces that we've published over at The Real News. But I would be remiss if I didn't give a big shout out to all of the amazing folks, who really collaborated with us, consulted with us, and made this entire Wisconsin 2-part series possible. That includes the great folks at In These Times, like Hannah Faris and Alice Herman. And Alice was instrumental in putting this teacher series together, just like Hannah was instrumental in putting the farming series together. And of course, Cameron Granadino was my go-to guy for the whole thing. And he's been amazing, both shooting, recording, and editing stuff. Of course, Jules has been great helping us out with the podcast versions of these. But also, research consultants like Eleni Shermer, John Fleissner, John Yagi, Harvey J. Kay, John Shelton, and Adam Mertz. And of course, the great Real News team, including Cameron, Stephen Frank on audio, Kayla Rivara, Jocelyn Dombrowski. It's just been a real group effort, and I'm so thankful to everyone for all their amazing work on this. So from the bottom of my heart to all of you, thank you. And, to round this puppy out, like I said, we're kind of driving into the heart of darkness, as I say, in this interview. And we really zero in on Act 10 in 2011 and, the statewide protests against it, which were, known and are still known as the Wisconsin Uprising. And they comprised one of the largest sustained collective actions in the history of the United States. Like, it was a really big deal. And, anyone who was there in 2011 will attest to the collective spirit of resistance and solidarity that the uprising embodied, and to the lasting impact it left on all who participated. But, as we all know, the protests were ultimately unsuccessful in beating back Act 10. And, the short and long-term effects of its passage have been devastating for working people and for organized labor. And how could this coordinated assault on labor come to pass in Wisconsin, of all places? As we've been saying throughout this series, a state that used to be known as a bellwether of the labor movement and of the progressive movement. And, what lessons can the rest of us around the country learn from the 50-year war on workers that has changed the state of Wisconsin for generations? These are the questions that myself, Cameron Granadino, and Hannah Faris went to Wisconsin to investigate in the summer of 2021. And, after interviewing a number of amazing public school teachers and organizers in different parts of the state, who you've all heard by now, we finally came to the capital of Madison to meet with Frank Emspak and Adrienne Pagac, two veteran organizers, two brilliant people who were right in the thick of the grassroots revolt in 2011. And, we have an in-depth discussion in this episode about Act 10, the fate of the labor movement, and about the ongoing class war in Wisconsin. This is their story.
Hi, my name is Frank Emspak. I'm here in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm 78. I retired from the University of Wisconsin School for Workers, which is part of the education system and extension here, or was. Prior to that, for many years, even when I was a professor here, I was the president of our effort to organize university, United Faculty and Academic Staff. And for about 15 years prior to that, in the 70s and 80s, I was a skilled machinist. First at the United Shoe Machine in Beverly, Massachusetts, and then at the General Electric Company in Lynn. Around Lynn, we had approximately 8,000 people in that local, and I was elected as what amounts to a chief shop steward in one of the divisions, as well as to the National Negotiating Committee. Prior to that, I was actually here at the University of Wisconsin. I earned a PhD in labor history, discussing the breakup of the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Why was the left attacked? Who attacked it? What was the outcome, and what were the effects on the labor movement? And of course, in the midst of this was the war in Vietnam. I was out of school, and I became chairperson of the National Coordinating Committee on the War in Vietnam, which was the group that sort of coordinated the first international days of protest on October 15th and 16th, 1965. Worldwide, we were as surprised as everybody else that thousands and thousands of people from all over the country participated. People who came up with the idea was people out in Berkeley, California, Jerry Rubin, Jack Weinberg, and others. So we were part of a national movement, and I think that was just great. And I guess I was a troublemaker in high school, too, a little bit. But I think it's a pretty consistent position of saying that fighting for and trying to really find ways to build a democratic society here.
Mm-hmm. So as they say, you've been making good trouble for most of your life.
Yeah, I think so. It's a lot of people. I wasn't the only one, for sure.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to you, and I really can't thank you enough for sitting down and chatting with me about this. Because as you know, we're here as part of this collaboration with the Real News Network, and in these times, in a lot of ways, to investigate kind of where the labor movement has gone and where it needs to go after the passing of Act 10, after right to work, after this kind of the seeming culmination of a decades-long assault on working people, on the labor movement, and on democracy as such. And you have been kind of there on the front lines in a lot of ways, engaging with, fighting against, and building power within this sort of kind of swirling movement over the decades. And you had a really fascinating line in a recent piece that you wrote, kind of reflecting 10 years after Act 10 in the Wisconsin Uprising, where you give some of that deep historical perspective. And you say that the Wisconsin Uprising began on August 3rd of 1981. And I was wondering if you could kind of unpack that a little bit for viewers, and what happened in 1981, and how do you see it as kind of like the fulcrum of what would come to be in 2011?
Well, at that time, the air traffic controllers had announced they were going on strike. President Reagan said that if you do that, we're going to basically destroy you. I don't believe that they thought so, and certainly the labor movement didn't believe that. They thought that was beyond the pale. Brian Polai, who had been a conservative Republican, actually president of the union, had poor relations with the rest of the AFL-CIO because he had supported Reagan, and he supported President Reagan on the basis that Reagan would do something about the dire problems of the air traffic controllers. Well, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing for the air traffic controllers to take the world in their own hands, so to speak, and they went on strike, and Ronald Reagan fired them all. And the reason I said that Act 10 began then is because neither at that time nor in Act 10 in 2011 did the labor movement find a response to be able to emerge from that victorious. Everybody lost their job in the air traffic control thing, and it was the beginning of the real public concessionary movement, where the ruling class or the major corporations, however you want to look at it, began to say, maybe these people have feet of clay. Maybe they're really not capable of mobilizing. They don't have the vision. They don't have the people with them. And maybe we can get away with this. And that's what happened. And so you began to see in the 1980s this tremendous movement on the part of the major companies to demand concessions, basically saying, you want to keep your job, you're going to give up this, this, and this, and this, maybe not for you, but for new hires. And once that happened, you split the working class in that factory or that workplace, because now you have people doing the same thing, getting paid differently, being treated differently. And you have the organization, the union, saying, "Yeah, don't worry about it. We'll take care of you eventually. We'll work things out." But there's no vision, certainly, and you begin to see that in this sort of period of time that the labor leaders are as afraid of their own members as they were of the corporations, maybe more so of the corporations. And so the whole purpose of the labor movement, of a union to bring people together, is undermined. Not completely. Obviously, you had people saying no, and you had people resisting, and you had some labor leaders who said this is not the way to go. But overall, it was definitely a period of decline. But underlying all this, and I think this is important, you also had a period of disinvestment in industry here, of a rapid move by the corporations, because they were able to do it legally, to move production overseas and still import the goods and sell them at high prices. And so you eviscerate large sections of the labor movement. You have these big agglomerations of unions. They have 8,000 people, 10,000 people, like my local, 6,000, but anything over 1,000, really. There's enough people to be able to think about who is this corporation? What are they doing? They have the intellectual power to really begin to psych things out. Well, those are being destroyed. And so the very basis of a renewal, at least in terms of the industrial working class, is undercut. And the labor movement in general found no effective way to prevent or deal with capital mobility. At the same time, the corporations were very, very effective at preventing the growth of the labor movement through right to work and through all kinds of other things. The General Electric Company, which was probably 60%, 70% organized in 1949, was probably 25% organized in 1990, and there hasn't been one exception, which is now closed, one single factory that they opened since 1950 that has been unionized.
Wow.
You take the packing house industry, almost all of it was moved to other parts of the country, Nebraska and Iowa, out of Chicago, and is non-union. And so the companies were able, this is, it isn't just a supposition, they were able to undercut the base of that part of the labor movement. It was hidden because the public sector began to get organized. But it's a different type of ideology and a different type of relationship to the means of production, if we can speak in that language. And so the result was you have an intellectual and political evisceration of the labor movement. You've already gotten rid of the class-conscious people in the Reds. That was done in the 50s. So now you have people who are there who don't really or don't want to really face the fact that the companies that you're sitting with across the table, that the only thing they want to do is drive an axe in your head. And they're going to do everything possible to do that. You, on the other hand, have this institution you're trying to preserve, and you will do many, many things possible to do that. Concessions, this, that, and the other thing. And so that was sort of the framework in the 1980s. There were a few exceptions. Our local was an exception. Why? Because we had defense work. And so unlike everybody else on the North Shore of Boston, the textile people, the textile machinery people, the shoe machinery people, which is where I had been working, the GE is right there because highest paid, best benefits, 8,000 people, because they're making jet engines. Okay, but those were the exceptions. That says something else about democracy and other issues we might want to talk about later, that the defense industry became actually the funder for some of the largest industrial locals in the United States. That's true here in Wisconsin with Oshkosh Trucks, which used to make fire trucks and things like that, and now they're making the Humvee or the equivalent military vehicles. And so it was true in shipbuilding. The only ships being built are Navy ships. So you have a shift not only in the way industry is structured, but on who's paying. And all of that has an effect in terms of how you've envisioned the labor movement and your role in it. What was most important here is also a generational shift. When you in your 50s and 60s, you're thinking about, getting out and retirement. In the late 70s and early 80s, there was a huge influx of young people because the World War II people were leaving. And in industry, if you were 55 or 60, you would about had it physically. So you're on the way out. But you bring in a couple of thousand young people in a plant like in Lynn, we hired 2,000 people in a period of 3 years. Or in the place I represented, which went from 600 people to 900 people in a period of 18 months or 2 years, but most of them in their 20s, they're thinking of what are we going to be doing here for the next 30 years. So you have the actual physical basis for people wanting to do something, wanting to move out of this sort of crouch and hiding sort of vision. And so part of what was happening in the 70s and 80s, both in the private sector and the public sector, was a group of young people, not just radical people or anything, but just people who were looking to the future. And so you also had a basis for an upheaval. Hence, 1981, when all of a sudden you get a punch in the head, and the labor movement is unable to really mobilize and figure out what to do. That was why that was so crucial.
Hi, my name is Adrienne Pagac, and I am the former co-president of the Teaching Assistants Association, the oldest graduate student union here in the United States. I was co-president between 2011 and 2012, the year after Act 10 took effect.
Hell yeah. Well, Adrienne, thank you so much for joining us. It's a real honor to be sitting here with both of y'all. And, you can even hear it in both of your bios, right? One of the things that I think we're tracking with this shoot on the kind of intertwining legacies of Act 10 and the Hortonville strike of 74, I think the elephant in the room is that Wisconsin has a deep progressive history. It has a deep, deeply important role in the history of the labor movement. And now we're here, right? And so I think one of the big questions is, how do we get here, right? And what can Wisconsin tell us about the larger trajectory of the labor movement and the kind of reactionary backlash against it? Which, Frank, brings us kind of like to what you and I were talking about, which is like, where did that kind of shift in the labor movement come from? Where sort of the radicalism of the CIO, which you studied as a scholar, young scholar, where did that kind of get abandoned for kind of the very thing that you were talking about, saying that the very thing that made the labor movement so vulnerable in 1981 and 2011? Where did the labor movement kind of abandon rank and file direct action?
Well, that's a little different than when Wisconsin was progressive. Let me deal with that first.
Sure.
Wisconsin progressivism was a political movement here. It was not a labor movement. It was a small business, small farm, white movement. During the period of time that I think Victor Berger was mayor of Milwaukee, it became the most segregated city in the United States. So, when we talk about progressivism, and we're talking about the politics, it was a progressive Republican Party for a while, and then they moved to the Democrats. So politically, there are some progressive things here, except it always went back and forth. We did have Senator McCarthy. And then he was replaced by Senator Proxmire. And McCarthy had replaced the Follett. So Wisconsin has always been back and forth. That's the first thing. Second thing, on the labor movement in particular, Wisconsin was always an AFL state. The CIO, which came in as a much more radical thing in places like Alice Chalmers, which is gone, and some of the Gishalt machine tool, which is gone, which made... but not the packing house. That was an AFL union, which meant it was segregated and did not believe in direct action at Oscar Mayer. So you had a tension here all the way along with a very conservative, craft-oriented labor movement, even in the paper industry, which was gradually organized. It was originally paper workers, not everybody else in the plant, and it was a Southern Union, which was segregated. And so there are aspects of the movement here that are very different. Now, northern Wisconsin, where you had this massive Finnish organization and the iron mines and the woodworking, that was completely different, a different planet. But if you take the labor movement as a whole in Wisconsin, it was always pretty narrow. That was true with AFSCME when it was formed. This is where AFSCME began. But it was based on a position of working with the state to make it better, not as an uprising of starving, public sector workers. It was just simply not that at all. And so I think there's always been this sort of bifurcation here in the state. And the racism part is extremely important because Wisconsin is almost all white. You have this massive problem in Milwaukee. I mean, you've seen it. What did we have in the 60s? People, trying to walk to South Milwaukee, attacked on that bridge every night for months and months and months. And so you have a situation here which has progressivism in politics, but a labor movement which was not distinguished by the kind of upheavals that you saw in, say, Detroit. The one huge upheaval we had here, which was the Alice Chalmers strike in 1948, which was led in part by communists, was destroyed in large part by Walter Reuther, coming in at the last moment, all kinds of maneuver. It's not important. But basically, that left leadership was eliminated. And so the basis for that kind of labor movement basically disappeared. Alice Chalmers is gone. One after the other, the automobile plants are gone. Allen Bradley, which was in the United Electrical Workers, went from like 5,000 people to 200 and is gone. And so the physical basis of a CIO mentality, of a mobilization from below mentality, was always limited here and is now almost gone. That is important in terms of what happened with Walker. The Fox Valley, up where it's got a lot of heavy industry, had a 40% Republican vote right through. The only shift was about 5%, which put Walker in. But the Republicans have a base in the working class here which was way beyond what most people really thought. And you and I and Adrienne might think that's like a 5-alarm fire, but it didn't bother everybody else in the same way. But I'm sorry, I went on too long.
No, that was really great and helpful context. I mean, because I think it not to editorialize or kind of pave over the complexities of the history too much, but I guess by way of like bringing us up to 2011, right? I mean, if Walker was a genius about one thing, it was divide and conquer, right? It was about pitting working people against one another. And I'm maybe inferring a bit that one of the ways that he was so able to effectively do that is because the labor movement in Wisconsin has a deep kind of segmented history where there was never as big of a kind of mobilized, unified sense.
Well, if you're, I'm sure Adrienne's going to want to say something here, but here is we were talking about it earlier, was these places are closing, people are agreeing to concessions. There was nothing that was offered here, either by the Democrats. You get another few weeks of unemployment, your plant's closed, and you're in a paper mill someplace. What are you going to do, right? So what Walker did, he said to people, you're paying for these public sector benefits. He said it straight out. Do you want to do that? You don't have them anymore. Why should you be paying these people? He didn't hide that. And he said, divide and conquer. That was his thing. He said it in every Republican gathering he was at. Publicly, he would talk about that the public sector is stealing from you. You're working hard. You've lost your medical benefits. Now you're paying for her. What's the matter with you? And that worked. But that's because the labor movement, and by extension the Democratic Party, had no response that I could understand anyway.
Yeah. So, Adrienne, let's toss it to you.
Yeah, I don't have, again, the depth that Frank has, but what I would say about the labor movement in general, not just in Wisconsin, but I think we got here in this moment, here to 2011 and beyond, because of the very nature in which labor actually did give up its right to engage in direct action. It chose to engage in labor management accords and say, we will put aside direct action and instead we will negotiate in a regular fashion for working conditions, wages and benefits, right? And so for a good number of years, that actually worked really, really well. And there was labor peace. And that's what the government wanted. That's what the captains of industry wanted. And maybe that's what workers wanted also, right? Because many people did benefit, not all people, as we are sure to understand. But that also means that there were decades where there was actually literally no opportunity, no practice, no engagement of the rank and file. And so when that atrophies, that muscle, that memory, we forget that, right? So in part, I think that explains why when we came to 2011, where it did and didn't go. But also thinking and then I think about the way in which we even negotiate contracts, right? We are negotiating shop by shop. We don't have, in many respects, sectoral bargaining. And believe me, I'm not a fan of anything that's coming out of New York State right now, but because that's not the way. But if we think, and we, as workers, as rank and file union members, that we fight for what is ours and we don't consider what we broadly need to fight for, then that is a very easy way to cleave us apart, to divide and conquer us. And yes, as Frank said, that, Walker posed the question not about saying that the public sector workers were the haves and everybody else were the have-nots, as opposed to asking a question and making space, which is also something that big labor didn't do. Not that we weren't asking about it in my own union, but why wasn't the question, yes, this is what we have, and what do you need to do in order to get it? That was not on the table of things to ask, and as far as I'm concerned, none of big labor asked that question. It was never posed to the public, and we just had like a voice that was much too small to even be heard to actually reframe the question. The debate was never challenged, and that's part of the problem.
I also think that Adrienne is absolutely right. Most people go to work, not to grieve, and they want a smooth sailing. So if you have a situation where, as you did from about 1950 to 1975 in many places, 25 years, a long time, as long as nothing really went wrong, you would get a wage increase, you would have your medical benefits, we got dental or this, that, or the other thing. Pension. All those things, so that in a heavy industrial place like Lynn, Massachusetts, GE, they had what people thought was a family wage in 1975. Namely, the guy would be at work, the wife would be maybe a teacher part-time, maybe doing something else, but that was enough to have a standard of living that allowed you to have a vacation, someplace up north, a little cabin or something somewhere, and the kids go to school and maybe get into the university. So that worked for 25 years in many, many places, not for black people, not for Hispanic people, not for women in many industries, but enough. And I think that when the companies went after everybody, when they saw the weakness, and that was the importance of 1981, when they saw they didn't have to do that anymore, they didn't. And they haven't.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, taking kind of a bird's eye view of it, we talk about, how far the movement fell after Act 10, but in a ways it was a sign of how far we had already fallen, that the concept of a pension was so exploitable as a special affordance to one sector of workers that the rest of the workforce saw as just that, right? That Walker was able to exploit it as this kind of goodie that these this pampered class of workers got, not that this is something that everyone should fucking have. Sorry, pardon my French. Not that this should be a basic expectation for any working person. And I wanted to also toss in there something that I imagine, Adrienne, intersects with your kind of experience in the movement, right? Because one of the things that Frank and I were talking about is how even within, sectors of the economy, you started seeing this sort of hierarchical segmentation of workforces. Sure as hell happened in academia, right? You had the kind of privileged tenured class. Graduate students had to fight to have their ability to represent themselves in a union. All the while, over decades, this increasingly massive underclass of underprotected, non-unionized, overexploited workers was building. And like in so many other kind of sectors of the economy, they weren't protected. I mean, they had nowhere to kind of turn. And so it just became kind of another way that, organized labor did not have a robust response for protecting kind of all working people and not just a few.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, it was a rude awakening to come to graduate school with a plan to pursue a PhD in order to actually achieve a living wage job. And when I soon began in speaking with other graduate students, I learned that actually wasn't the model that was in existence, at least in terms of the industry, right? That there is a small group of tenured professors that are supported by or enabled by, and I don't mean this in any sort of, they themselves aren't doing the exploiting, but there are so many adjunct instructors, professors who cannot get a full-time job because of the way in which the industry has been restructured, where I would argue it is has a large professional managerial sector or segment, and that, as you said, graduate students have continued to fight for recognition for their labor, in addition to the fact that they are learning to become the instructors, the academics, the researchers of the future, the scientists of the future, right? And then there's also within the graduate student population too, there is also, I found while I was a member of the TAA, that there is also a failure to recognize in some segments of campus, hard sciences versus soft sciences and the humanities, that some of us, the soft sciences, the humanities, were more willing to accept our belonging to a working class, whereas the hard sciences were much more resistant to that notion, were much more resistant to the idea that they needed to belong to a union, that it would benefit them, that it was something that would support them, that it would advance their careers, advance their schooling, advance what they wanted to do. And in fact, they saw it as something, I believe that within the hard sciences, there was an emphasis on their professionalism, their white collar, the white collar nature, and so there was also on campus kind of a division between how graduate students themselves, professors themselves, see their role in a labor movement broadly.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's use that as a way to kind of talk about 2011, right? So let's drive into the heart of darkness here. And I wanted to ask, since again for this documentary, where we are talking to a number of people about where were you in all of this, right? And so I think it would be great to kind of hear you both talk about, I guess just from your own experience, where you were when Walker got elected. Did you see this coming? Did you see, the cracks in organized labor starting to show? What were your kind of, how were you involved in the uprising? And then after that, we can maybe talk about where labor goes after this, what the effects have been, and how people are trying to kind of organize out of the rubble. So I guess whoever wants to go first, where were you in the lead up to 2011?
Okay, so 2011, I recall having a general membership meeting before the announcement that Walker made about the budget repair bill. That's what Act 10 was called. And the reason I remember the meeting is because there had been a piece run by David Blaschka. Is that his name? Am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay. Well, in our local free newspaper, The Isthmus, that outlined in broad strokes what Walker was going to do. And I remember asking our political education chair, is this for real? And he said, no, this is just his wet dream. Don't worry about it. And then I swear to God, some days later, I got a call. It was 9:00 at night. I had just finished dinner with a friend at the near the Capitol, from one of our staffers at the TAA saying, we have a copy of the budget repair bill. We have access to a copy of the budget repair bill. Please come into the office and let's talk about it. So a few of us, maybe 5, the 2 co-presidents, myself, 2 staffers, and maybe some others, I don't recall, huddled around a telephone in our office as somebody in the Capitol building who is a staffer and who had received the bill early read it to us over the phone because they couldn't give it to us. And so we were making notes with our mouths kind of agape about what was coming. And that evening, I sent an email to my department saying, this is not a drill. We need you to come to the office. And this is, let me tell you, after years and years of trying to get people involved, offering to walk with them to a meeting, asking for their opinion, checking in, having organizing conversations, you get 1, 2 people. But when I sent out that email, everybody came. everybody came to the office, and we made poster, like we had already had a plan, actually. This was actually somewhat a really lovely coincidence for us. I don't know if it was so for Scott Walker, but we had already planned. We knew that once he was elected that he would introduce a bunch of draconian cuts to public education, and that would include higher education. So we had established we called it the I Heart UW campaign. So we had printed these Valentine's cards with the I Heart UW on the front and on the back. It was addressed to Scott Walker, and then all of our people on campus could address the governor and say, please, for whatever reason, fund the UW. So we collected thousands of those, and it was our intention on the 14th, before the Joint Finance Committee was to hear and talk about the bill, we were going to deliver these Valentines. Well, the governor wasn't in. But because the bill's announcement came out, I would say on February 10th, it wasn't just graduate students that marched from campus to the Capitol to deliver those Valentines. There were faculty, there were lots of undergraduates from the Student Labor Action Coalition and other groups that accompanied us, and our march was actually quite large. The Valentines were delivered, and then once the Joint Finance Committee began hearing testimony, we had asked members to bring a pillow and a sleeping bag to be prepared to sleep at the Capitol so we could deliver our testimony. And we knew that, if we got on the list, it could be hours. You could be there in the middle of the night. And so I brought my sleeping bag and a pillow. Actually, my boss for my production or my project assistantship lent me one of her pillows, and her son delivered it to me. It was really sweet. And we prepared to spend the night. I remember standing in line, waiting to give my testimony with the Joint Finance Committee with at least 100 people in that hallway. And that was when I think Lena Taylor came out and said they weren't going to hear any testimony anymore. This was like at 9:00 at night. And they shut it down artificially. Or preemptorily. And they read a statement about why they weren't going to take any more testimonies from people. And so we decided, we already had our sleeping things, that we would just spend the night and wait to give our piece. And it was later that evening, I think, that the Democrats in the Assembly chose to open up a hearing room to take those testimonies anyway. And after that, and slowly thereafter, MTI got sick, teachers got sick, showed up at the Capitol, high school students marched on the Capitol. It blew up from there. It was really, really wonderful.
Did you expect it to get as big as it did?
No, not at all. Like we had planned, like the TAA, our members had planned to go to the Capitol to give our testimony, right? We had no idea. And we had no idea that other unions were going to do other things. And this is part of the problem. Maybe it's actually quite beautiful. Like the cool part for us anyway, my reflections after 2011 and the occupation and the uprising was that we didn't ask for permission from AFT to do any of that. We did it because we knew that this is what we needed to do. And so we decided to take action collectively. And when we were in the Capitol, we also made all of our decisions collectively. So I distinctly remember sitting in a meeting room and someone from SEIU told us to do something. And we said, no, we talk about it we need to meet with our members and talk about it. And then we make the decision collectively. It's not, you don't give us marching orders. And what was beautiful in the beginning was that I think it was very much like that it was collective decision making that determined what we did. And then, the big honchos came in and they set up shop in the Madison Concourse Hotel across the street, where I know they had a big ballroom, but I don't know what they were doing in the Capitol. Yeah.
I guess for people watching who maybe don't know who you're referring to, the big honchos.
Oh, I'm just talking about, I would say, the state AFL leadership, the larger...
Well, absolutely. Marty was there. So was the president of the AFT. The president, Mary Bell was there. And David Newt. Was David still president? No, maybe not. Maybe Phil was president of the AFL-CIO.
Yeah, Phil.
But they refused to meet with anybody. I mean, basically. But I started about, we were running a national news organization by that time for many years. So starting in November, I had 2 reporters and myself. We started covering this because we were very worried. And we were actually at the press conference where the Democrats lost. So the Democratic strategy was to maintain control of the Senate. The AFL-CIO strategy, or AFSCME strategy, this has been going on for almost 15 years, never settling their contract until after the election, and then settling the one that was for the prior 2 years, so that they'd start the next fiscal year negotiating on that contract. Well, that's fine. So the Senate is evenly divided. This guy named Russ Decker was the deciding vote. I was at the press conference. He comes in and says, well, I just wanted you to know I quit, and walks out. At which point, the Democrats no longer control the Senate. So Marty Beal's strategy of doing this like he had for years and demobilizing people out the window. Now, legally speaking, their contract expires in 3 weeks. Okay? They don't have a contract. Walker didn't cancel the contract. They canceled their strategy canceled it. So Walker then demands draconian cuts. The AFL-CIO and the AFSCME people agree to all of them, hundreds of millions of dollars. And Walker says, well, I don't think so. We don't have to agree with you. We don't have to sign another contract. This one's expiring, so we're not going to sign a contract. It's over. Forget it. And that, then the ball dropped. Everybody said, oh my God, can you do this? Because now you have AFSCME, their state organization, with no contract. So the whole strategy of 30 years out the window. Now, this is the first week in January, I think, by that time. Then he comes out with the budget repair bill, officially going after everybody else. But again, from a historical point, this is the second time. In 1992, when the hospital corporation was set up, when I privatized UW Hospital, the legislation eliminated the nurses' union. And the AFL-CIO and everybody agreed with that. Okay, I happened to be there at 5 a.m. in the morning in the basement of the State House, and we figured this out and got somebody to propose something else. And so the nurses were covered. But the AFL-CIO is the position of people until we have this phone call was, okay, too bad. So this whole idea of getting rid of the unions was already well-traveled ground 10, 15 years later in terms of a legislative way of doing that, plus the fact that the university hadn't been able to get organized or anything. So then they lower the boom and say, well, we're not going to bother. And then you have a Democratic uprising. So what was interesting to me, because we had reporters here every day, and we'll give it to you, this great audio of that we have from the State House of the high school kids talking, and of our reporter backpedaling down the street saying, oh my God, this is amazing. But what you had was this huge outpouring of people, but not organized by the trade union movement. WEAC was very, very proud of the fact that they called all of their 93,000 members during that first week. They didn't tell them to come to Madison. They told them to go to work and come to Madison on Saturday and not disrupt anything, because the strategy of the AFL-CIO was to do constant polling, not do anything, to antagonize the people of the state and show that they had power. It wasn't just it didn't happen. It was opposed by the leadership, and that's different. And it was, and you saw it this way. Thousands of people came here. Most of them were non-union people. There was never one sign-up sheet for a union in the entire 4 weeks or so of that occupation. You couldn't walk up to somebody and say, I want to join a union, can I sign here? Absolutely not. Not one. Well, I think that's a message there, you know. The other thing that happened is you have, 6,000 state workers that were organized within 500 feet of the Capitol, something like that. Never once were they asked to take a long lunch or drop in and see what's going on officially. That their union, the AFT or WEAC, or the WEAC a little different, or the AFSCME would say to people, why don't you come over at lunchtime? If it's true, it's pretty crowded, and if maybe you're going to have to take an hour or so to get back. Nothing was done like that in any part of the state. So when you have an organization that refuses to mobilize, refuses to take the one thing they have and use it, you're going to lose. And that's really what happened. And I think that you have this tremendous outpouring of people fighting for democracy, operating almost on their own. Some local unions tremendous, others saying, it's not me. People from all over the country understanding what's going on here, but never once the leadership of the trade union movement meeting with the people in the Capitol saying, well, here's a strategy, whatever it is. Even they never disagreed with it, but nobody would ever do that. And that's a profound failure. When the only group that had any sense about here, Madison Teachers Inc., said, well, let's try the Constitution. We have First Amendment rights. Let's give it a shot. We're out because we're into freedom of association and free speech. Let's see what happens. Well, it worked, and it's unsafe to be in school when all this chaos is going on. We don't want our teachers to be subject to that. Well, that could have happened all over. That was the kind of failure of leadership. And I think the reason I started my thing about 1981 is because you saw the same thing.
Can I just jump in and say that I completely agree with what Frank just described. And I also want to say that I still think it was incredibly important. I would never in my wildest of dreams figured that sort of action, the uprising, the occupation would have happened in Madison, Wisconsin. I don't think people in Wisconsin thought that was going to happen ever. And so, I hadn't seen such numbers since I was in New York City protesting the Iraq War in 2004, right? So this was out of the blue. And I think that it's still, even though we made some very serious mistakes, and we meaning the broader labor movement, for precisely the reasons that Frank just described, it is still really important that happened. Because I think in all of the conversations I had with all of those very different people that were complete strangers to me, I think that showed them what direct action is after never having experienced it before in their lives, even if it was protest as direct action as opposed to strike, work stoppage, anything like that. When we think about the labor movement, of course, like our ultimate weapon, but it did familiarize and introduce people to something that they had absolutely no exposure to. And I remember speaking to actually one police officer from Watertown, which is a small town, I think, southwest of Wisconsin or Madison. And he had come in because they had to bus in. They basically had to call in extra police to patrol the Capitol. And his family didn't want him to come up to Madison, precisely for some of the reasons that Frank has also talked about, this fear of a progressive, radical Madison. And God knows what they were watching on whatever news source that they were using. But he decided to come up and do the shift. And he called his family from the Capitol. And I was doing... I was kind of being a monitor, so just making sure everything was fine and walking around. We all took different shifts while we were in the Capitol for those weeks, and I asked him how he was finding it, and he was telling me he was actually having a really good time. When his family called, he said, they were alarmed by the noise in the background, and oh my God, are you okay? Is everything fine? He said, no, this is fine. They're playing music and they're laughing and dancing, and everything is okay. And he couldn't believe what he was seeing either. So why do I say this? I say this because I think, as I reflect on it, we were planting seeds then, and those seeds take time to grow and then to be harvested, right? And so seeing those young people, seeing those high schoolers march from every single high school in Madison down to the Capitol for their teachers, because they understood that this bill was going to negatively impact the people that care about them, show up for them every day, want them to succeed, nurses, snowplow drivers, all of that I choose to believe that that's going to grow into something, and it has to start somewhere. And we were for many decades without any sort of response like that.
I think that notion that you have 100,000 people who really had this sense of democracy and what's right, didn't have to be told what to do about that, coming from all over the state. I was up in Pleasant Prairie, Wisconsin, about a year later, at a meeting at a school talking about this. And this is a year later. And they said, oh, yeah, we got all the parents together and sent 2 school buses down to Madison. Pleasant Prairie, if you can find it, is 50 miles north of Eau Claire and about 100 miles east of Minneapolis. So you can't get a much more isolated rural spot like that. And that was the feeling. And I think it was such a tremendous sense of togetherness, upheaval, the ability to move forward. And I guess my aggravation, that's a pretty weak word, bitterness, real anger in a certain way, is that almost immediately every attempt was made to suborn this and make it into a Democratic Party, political maneuver there to have a recall and this and that. Now, by that time, we were covering and had a state radio network, so we knew the vote, county by county, precinct by precinct. As it was coming in, we got fewer votes then than we did in the first place, because you had a weak candidate, people running away from the event, and you just had this whole attempt to push it aside. The only thing to do is to have electoral politics. And you lose that spirit. You don't call it for what it is, the destruction of public education. That might have worked, but you don't do what they did. And I think that this sense and the leadership here of not having any real connection to or sense of the power or really belief in the most fundamental way of working people, of their members, of the people in the state was fatal, because it was the people in the state who were there. When you went around and asked people, we interviewed thousands of people, I suppose, over a month. Some of the CDs you have now or will have later, and a lot of people said, no, we're not in the union, but we know why it's important. We know why it's important. Then people had things like supporting the people in Egypt and all kinds of stuff. There was a real sense that this was part of an international belief and the support of democracy and how fundamental it was. I think that was suborned, and deliberately so, over the next 5 or 6 months, and in some cases today.
Well, I think that kind of brings us around the turn to where I want us to end up, right? Because I think about, that emotional experience, right? To be there for what was like the largest kind of demonstration in Wisconsin history until the next day when it broke that record, right? To be a part of that leaves a deep imprint on you, of course, and to see and be part of that solidarity and to feel people supporting one another, even if they themselves are not in the union, even if they themselves are not a public sector worker. It's a really beautiful and incredible thing. And I think that, 10 years later, it's very easy. I wouldn't say easy, but I've noticed a lot of defeatism, which I can understand, because Adrienne, you mentioned the Iraq War protests, right? I feel that especially people in maybe the millennial generations on down, what we have seen is some of the largest mobilizations of people in our lifetime against the Iraq War, against Act 10, and Occupy, Black Lives Matter protests for the past 10 years against Donald Trump. And it feels like it goes nowhere, right? That's the narrative, right? That's the impression that some people get. And I think that's why it's really important for people to listen to what both of you were saying, is that will to be democratic, that will to embrace solidarity and build something was there. What we lacked were the kind of committed mechanisms for transforming that into something other than just votes for the Democratic Party. And so I wanted to ask if each of y'all could kind of respond to that pervasive sense of defeat that we know is there in the state after Act 10, and how to not succumb to that fully, but while still learning from the experience. And then the last kind of question is really, where do we go from here? Where are people going from here? Where do you see signs of hope where people are trying to correct the missteps that the movement made that made us so vulnerable in 2011?
I think that apathy is deeply rooted in Wisconsin, actually. These past 10 years have actually been really, really brutal. I don't know that I don't know that I have a happy answer to that defeat. That's not to say that there isn't there aren't examples of a fight back, because I think, of course, there are. But broadly speaking, you just need to look at the union data in Wisconsin to know how terrible, what a terrible impact Act 10 had on unions here in the state, public sector in particular. Because private sector unionization has been on the decline since the 73. I have no idea. For a long, long time. I think that we need what Frank and I recognize. I think, and I would say that other rank and file union members also recognize, people that have left politics, is that it wasn't enough. Demonstration isn't enough, right? Like that's. All of those actions, those moments that you just described, enumerated, were really, really, really important. But actually, I can say that this past year for the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests over the murder of George Floyd actually does illustrate my point, which is and the point is this: you have to shut it down. It's not enough just to make noise. You actually have to shut it down. And what do I mean by shutting it down? I mean shutting down everyday living. And that's what Frank was talking about, I feel, or that's what I heard Frank say when he posited the question, why didn't AFT contact all of its locals and ask their members to engage in, suddenly get sick, engage in a work stoppage, have an, basically wildcat, because that would have, by grinding everything to a halt, by exercising the power that we have as working people, the state broadly, society broadly cannot continue as is. And so that's when you bring people to the table, and they actually do take you seriously, and they see that, nope, actually there is a problem here and people are tired of it. And I think, what really struck me is that while we were down at the Capitol those weeks, I understood from other people who were still on campus that campus was functioning just as it was. It was a tale of two places. It was as if nothing. If you had no idea, they had no idea. Some of them what was going on at the Capitol, and in a way, I think that was by design, right? It was also a lack of all of these structures that we've been talking about, institutions and other things.
I think that if you look at this, I want to make one historical and personal note about this. So it isn't just a theoretical thing that Adrienne. So my personal history was that working in industry, but even here at the university, that when we were able to have stoppage of work, then the company has to say, it's costing us $5,000 an hour for these guys to stand around here. Is it worth it? And if you planned properly and did things, then it wasn't worth it for them, and you would win. What the way the Marxists used to talk about it was the control of the means of production. And that's the importance of having the left being thrown out of and destroyed in the labor movement, because one thing that we have lacked since 1955 or so, and it's not necessarily the Communist Party, but a class-conscious organization that's part of the labor movement, not just coming from the outside. And I think that when was kidding Adrienne before about where she, Czechoslovakia or Hungary or whatever, but the fact of the matter is, in the generation that organized the unions in this country, in part, it was through these language federations and whatnot, where people like my family were Marxists of some kind, anti-clerical Marxists, as a matter of fact, in the Catholic community. So, but that was there. And those connections were shattered after the 40s. And that was a strategic win. And it's strategic because it wasn't that you needed somebody in Moscow to say, time to go on strike. But you would have a respected person who had some broader sense of class and of how wealth is produced, saying to their fellow workers, hey, look what's happened to us here. These people are standing up. Maybe we should do something about it. That is what's missing in this country, in my opinion. And if we talk about the left and we talk about voice and democracy, we're going to have to find a way, if we want to win here, to have those people, whether they're baristas or working as a clerk in the city or the county or making an automobile, have some sense that there are things we do that are valuable to the society and that we need to be able not to do them in order to win. Then that's a pretty big step. And we've not moved, as far as I can see, much between 2011 and today. To, I think, maybe agree, maybe emphasize more what Adrienne said within the unions here, within AFSCME, within the AFT and whatnot. I don't see it. I'm talking about it now from doing a radio show every week and reporting on these things and interviewing people now for 10 years, I don't see a strategy on the part of the public sector that says, here's how we're going to win, other than vote for Democrats, who were reluctant to bring forward an Abolish Act 10 resolution, incidentally. So I don't see that sense within the public sector. The private sector is a whole other question, but I don't see it in the public sector. I don't see even using the tools that we have to fight for democracy and against privatization, for example, or making the case that we made in the 90s, can markets govern? I wrote that with somebody in AFSCME in Illinois. Can markets govern? Is privatization bad? Markets and governing in the public sector is fundamentally anti-democratic. And that really had resonance. It's that kind of sense of class and a sense of self-worth, which gets into the apathy part, that is missing here.
It also gets to the lack of organizing being done by labor organizations too, right? You actually have to invest resources in order to empower workers, educate workers, to demand dignity in the workplace and away from the workplace. And so to Frank's point, I am unaware, not because maybe it's happening, I just don't know it, of whether or not the major public sector unions here in Wisconsin are actually organizing. And by organizing, I mean not getting people to sign a union card, right? Like, that's great, fine. But I mean actually becoming empowered rank and file. And I think in part, some of the reasons why they're not doing that is because I actually do think that some union leaderships are afraid of an empowered rank and file, right? That they don't trust that the rank and file will make the quote unquote right decision. This is, in my opinion, this is why us rank and filers in 2011 wanted to do certain things, and yet what I call big labor, the labor leaders of the major organizations, chose to funnel their energies towards electoral politics. And I also think that they chose that path because that's actually a familiar one that they've become so unfamiliar with and actually turned off by the time and resources that organizing requires, because it's not a cyclical thing. It can't be done in 6 months or a year. There isn't some sort of final end, right? And you can't repeat the same plan over and over again necessarily because, hey, working people are different. Like, all people are different. You have to meet them where they are. You have to find out what their issues are. It was just easier. Potentially, they considered it more cost effective to pursue the electoral political route. It certainly was, I don't know, you just had a greater sense of what the outcome would be in a way, because you knew what the deliverables were. And organizing people, there are no guarantees.
But I think something else is going on. I just finished reviewing a transcript I made of somebody who was deeply involved in politics in 1946. And in 1944, as we all remember, right, the CIO at that time mobilized this huge effort in their CIO Political Action Committee. Their objective was to get Henry Wallace to be the vice president. They lost that. They got Truman instead. But they mobilized this huge number of people, electing a Democratic Congress and Roosevelt. Well, the Democratic Party smartened up, and after that made a real effort to get each of those shop stewards and all those people to be Democratic Party leaders, lower-level officials, or whatever, essentially taking that over and realizing that that's what people were willing to do. Well, a generation later, you have this system of the Democrats, and that's it. In Wisconsin, and in Madison in particular, where you had independent political action of one sort, because we have nonpartisan elections, the South Central Federation of Labor has never endorsed a progressive Dane person or anybody else for office without endorsing a Democratic too. We've had 2 endorsements sometimes. But they wouldn't, even if that person, that progressive Dane person, had a better labor record, was a member of a union, was even an officer of a union. So that's it isn't just politics. It's politics substituting for real action, but politics in a very narrow way. And I think also driven by the whole national security state and other things. I don't think we can separate the moves in this country over 50 years away from any sense of working class ideas. The working class disappeared as a historical construct. If you think about it, when you listen to the reports every day on the radio, they don't talk about working class. They don't say working class wages. Everybody's in the middle class. You would think everybody owns stock, judging from the fact, every day there's a stock report. 10% of the population owns stock. What about the rest of the 90%? So I think that there's this phenomenal sort of shift here in terms of conscious. And that we're not immune from that. We're not immune from that if nobody has a framework to even think about what a family wage might be, or that we're working people, not all middle class somehow, or lawyers or whatever. Then it becomes very, very hard to move in that direction. But it isn't just happenstance, I think. I think people really think about this. But in the labor movement in particular, the deal with the Democrats has always been support us, and you will get some things. You'll be appointed as head of this poverty commission, or you'll be appointed to the unemployment compensation commission. And,
or we're your only other choice.
Yes.
In a two-party
when it isn't,
system.
When it
no,
isn't.
of course,
Right.
course, but
that's it.
When we're in a two-party system, let's say, the option is choose us or the other guy who's worse. That is the frame. And so, yes, do Frank and I believe that is not the only option on the table? Absolutely. This is why, to return to my experience after Act 10, we had this debate in our own local, in the TAA, about whether or not we support or endorse a candidate that had been running in the primary to defeat Walker, right the state ended up choosing the rerun. I don't have any idea why they thought he didn't make it the first time, but that second time is going to be aces, right? So we had a debate about whether or not to endorse a candidate, Kathleen Falk. My co-president and myself disagreed on our strategy, and it turns out that our local itself also had major disagreements. We ultimately did not endorse. So I suppose my side won, let's say. But the question for me was really, so Kathleen Falk, this candidate, refused to confirm that she would repeal Act 10 if elected. She could not say it. She could not even say that she would guarantee that she would restore collective bargaining rights, let alone all of the other things that were stripped out by Act 10. So why in the world is it in our interest to vote for you, to actually, for our organization? My gripe was that, so why are we going to support you? What are you doing for us? Tell me how you are going to fight for us as working people. And I didn't feel that she had the answer, and my counterparts felt she was better than the alternative. And so that is a very difficult conversation to have about, do you want to fight for what you want? Or do you fight, to use a metaphor, do we want to argue for enlarging the pie? Or are we just going to fight for the biggest piece of pie we have given the size, right? And for the majority of us, I can't even remember, it was likely a narrow majority, but we chose no, that we are not a pawn of the Democratic Party. They don't just get to call on us and then we turn out and knock doors and make phone calls. No, what have you done for me lately? And the fact of the matter is, the Dems hadn't been doing anything for the University of Wisconsin system for some time. We had been running the UW-Madison had been running a structural deficit since I came and well before. And each time, did the university go back to the state and say, "Hey, we need more money"? Nope. It was like an Oliver Twist situation. Thank you, sir. I'll take what I get. There was no fight for what we need, and no outreach to the rest of the state to advocate and to educate the citizens of Wisconsin as to why this was important and why this was valuable.
Well, the situation we're in now, however, even that isn't working. We're seeing a decline in the standard of living. We're seeing it's impossible for the kids to go to school. The Wisconsin idea here was built on the tax system and whatnot, that if your kid in high school got a C, he could go to the state schools, the teachers' colleges then, and if he got an A, he could go to the University of Wisconsin in Madison or in Milwaukee, and it was $125 a semester. I told this to the TAA's board one day, and I thought somebody broke into tears, and the fact of the matter is that that was the deal, and that's long gone. You would have to have the university used to be supported by the state of Wisconsin, 80% of the budget. Now it's 22%. So obviously it's going to cost money for somebody to go to school here. But all of these types of things have gone down the drain, whether it's the pensions you talked about, the notion of a family supporting wage, universal medical benefits, public transportation, everything is on the decline. Biden has said, well, we don't have to do it this way, we can do this. And it's being fiercely resisted by the Republicans, who may be organizing, for all we know, another insurrection. This is the end. This is the end. When you destroy the trade union movement, you destroy a democratic pillar. And that's what's happening here. And it's happening in other parts of the country. It isn't just Madison, the decline of the trade union movement. Unlimited capital mobility, which you cannot deal with unless you have a class perspective, will, I think certainly destroy the country, or is working on it. And this is a great conundrum that we have. What can we do? How do we build that class consciousness? How can we speak to people in some language that makes sense, other than divide and conquer or scaring people to death, which Trump has been excellent at? Okay. How do we say, We need to really begin to tax the rich here a little bit.
A little bit?
Well, a little bit. 5%. 5% was apparently too much, for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Okay, so how do we build that class-conscious element? It isn't just enough to be militant. Anybody can be mad, and anybody can demand something. But understanding how it's actually going to work is another question. And the trade union movement in this country has worked on three things, as far as I can see, over the last 120 years. Young people showing up because the generation has changed. Some class-conscious people being in there to try to help out and give perspective, people who were indigenous to the population in a way. Then a group of other people who recognized something was wrong and were willing to work with other people that were more radical to fix it. But you're not going to have a movement if everybody in it's over 60 and thinking about getting out. And I think one of the sociological things that's happening is that you're having this generational switch right going on now. And so you're having lots and lots of young people coming to work, whether it's at Epic or whether it's as a barista, who are saying, wait a minute, do I want to live like this for another 30 years? And the answer is no, but I think that what's the mechanism is the question.
I thought that was... Yeah, really amazing and beautifully put by both of you. And I think just to end on a philosophical note, because I think that one missing element to this, or something that's more latent in everything we've been talking about, right, is that politically to, become over-dependent on the political machine of the Democratic Party, I think the failures of that are now self-evident, especially after what y'all laid out. But I think that another kind of element to this is how the sort of ideology of the Democratic Party infected, like, the labor movement as well, right? Being this sort of, a victory lap of neoliberalism at which the sense was that the biggest battles, it was almost like the realization of the dream of Samuel Gompers, right? It's like, oh, we made it. we have reached the pinnacle. With industrial society, we have reached the pinnacle of what human society can be. Now we just got to twist the knobs a bit, adjust the pressure valves, and we'll find a kind of permanent state of labor peace. And with that, as long as people are in unions, democracy itself will be stabilized and permanent. And I think that one of the things that is really present in all of this is this notion that democracy, as we understand it, once we secure advances in the possibility of achieving democracy, that they're there forever, that they can't be undone. And I think one of my favorite titles of any book is by Astra Taylor. It's called Democracy Has Never Existed, but We'll Miss It When It's Gone. And I feel that sense of constant struggle to preserve that which is never fully realized, but is always at risk of going away, is the thing that also kind of relying on the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party itself as a political institution has fucked us all over by committing it to that notion, right? By believing that the progress made in the past can't be undone, while Republicans have been undoing it for decades. And I feel like that sort of ideology infected the labor movement over decades, and we stopped pushing forward, like you were saying, Adrienne, like we stopped pushing for the society that we want, and we kind of were in a permanently defensive posture, just trying to hold on to what we had gotten.
Mm-hmm. I think that was beautifully put. I would say that, so to me, neoliberalism, right? We focus on, we are atomized and hyper individualistic, contrary to what a labor union is designed to do, which is to build collective power, right? To think about the reason why unions are important is because it takes us away from the individual experience and instead provides a space for us to understand our collective experience and what we win, what we can get when we stand together, as opposed to framing our very existence, our very material existence, and putting that only on our individual shoulders, as if individual failures are yours alone, as opposed to societal problems, structural impediments, all of that. And so, yes, this is why a vibrant labor movement is really, really important. And what I think actually pre-existing labor unions have to relearn, many of them. Not all rank and file locals, of course, not all rank and file memberships, but some very much do. It's not about what you can get, you as the individual you. It's about what you guys can win and maintain and protect and fight for collectively. And that goes, and I think that what the Chicago Teachers Union in particular, going back to public sector unions and their fights, have been so wonderful at demonstrating, and UTLA and others afterwards, right? The teacher strikes of 2 years ago, right? Showing that you actually, within the public sector, the strategy to fight for more than just yourselves, but to fight for the community that you want, the school you want, the life that you want for your neighbors, is actually really, really important. And that's not focusing on what I got, what you got. It's not a comparison of, well, you got yours and I don't have it, so I want you not to have it too. Instead, it's how do we get it together? And we need to get there.
Well, it's funny you raised that. I was thinking, because I keep looking at all these transcripts I'm trying to get done, the fight about the 5-cent fare, which you no doubt remember from New York in 1948, right? Where the transit union for years and years and years there, under Mike Quill, Irish group, communist most of the time, their position was 5-cent fare for all New Yorkers. Staten Island Ferry was free, but anyway, the 5-cent fare. Well, contract comes up and they drop that, and they go and they're gonna big fight in the left. He leaves the Communist Party, among other things, over that issue because they said that's wrong. But that was the first, probably not the first, but it was one of the first real public displays of a public sector union, or one that was serving the public sector, making a differentiation between the needs of their members as they saw that and the public. And that, here we are 30 or 40 years later with Walker astutely using the same kind of issues, because over this whole period of time, there was very, very little, in fact, opposition in the public sector to that kind of stuff. They would agree to various increases in cost and never challenge the tax structure, or say that unless we reduce the taxes, these industries will leave the state. So, this is this issue that of the way the neoliberals were able to pose things. We have not really overcome that. Biden is saying we need billions, trillions of dollars, but he's not saying the real issue here was underinvestment due to neoliberalism. He just said, well, it happened somehow or other, or the COVID, or who knows. But in other words, there's not an attack. There's not an ideological point to this. And I think it's up to the left to do it. And I think we don't have a tremendous amount of time left to do it, because we see the Trump people mobilizing not necessarily working people, but people a little bit above, who do feel they've lost something, not only on a racial and cultural basis, but otherwise as well, saying, okay, we only have this amount, so we're going to keep ours. And if it means trashing the Constitution, getting rid of the government, hanging Mike Pence, it doesn't matter. We'll get ours. And I think we have to confront that directly. And I guess our great challenge is trying to figure out how to do that with pretty limited resources, and the importance of organizations like this to discuss it.
I would also just like to add, I think it's also really important to actually acknowledge that people have lost something. Lots of people have lost something. Wages have been stagnating for decades. And so when there's the perception, Kathy Kramer wrote this really great book, The Politics of Resentment, about urban-rural divides here in Wisconsin, and the perceptions of whether or not more money is going to urban areas versus rural ones. And in fact, the opposite is the case, but it's the rural population's perception that all of their money is going to support low-wage housing in Milwaukee, let's say, which is, of course, bound up in racial politics, right? Racism, quite frankly. But I think that we also have to acknowledge that working people of all kinds have actually lost. Yes. Why? Because the vast majority of the productivity gains and the GDP or capital that's generated is captured by a very, 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 very small segment of people. And so it is the case that a lot of people, I think, are experiencing downward mobility, economic and social mobility. And I don't think our strategy should be to say that that's actually not happening. It's to acknowledge that it is, but then to reveal or to educate why that's the case, as opposed to and challenge the frame that they've been using, which is, well, it's because this other group has taken something from me. No, we're all in this together, actually. And the people that are taking things from you, that's actually how it's designed, that it's working as it should. A very small group of people benefit while the rest of us grind away day after day. And I think our position is that that's not how it should be, and that's not how it has to be. We can actually build something better. And I don't mean to parrot the current president, because our understandings of what better is, I think, are drastically different.
But I think we hit upon this when we were talking about the university. The fact that in my generation, the expectation was a working class person, a rural person from a farm, could attend the University of Wisconsin and not bankrupt the family. That's gone. And that is a huge loss. And that's what I meant by breaking the social contract here in the state, starting around 1963 or 64. And you saw that. And it's that kind of fundamental loss. The way out is lost. I'm not going to have a job where I can spend 25 years working here and it's going to get better. The place is going to disappear. And, those are losses, and there's absolutely no question about that. But I think we, on the left, have to come up with the answers. And we have to say, okay, we want to fight for a tuition of $100 a year. What does that mean? Well, that means the taxes up there are going to have to go up. Well, they're going to leave the state. Well, they're leaving anyway. We have to be able to respond to that. And again, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier. We have to be able to respond to the plant closing and capital mobility question on both a practical level. Should the factory in Park Falls close, which it did, the international paper mill there, and if it does, what are we prepared to do to make it as costly as possible? And those types of things, those ideas are only going to come from the left.